Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are back. It is weekly review time. I am very, very excited to get this series back on track. We finally have regular season League of Legends in 2023, and it's time to go over what we saw in week 1 of the LPL Spring Split. First and foremost, before we jump into any review action, up in the iCard right now, you are going to see a video that is my 2023 LPL Power Rankings, my Spring Split Power Rankings. I go through all 17 teams. It's a 2.5 hour long video talking about the strengths, the weaknesses, what I think their upside looks like, where I think they might place. If you want to get full thoughts into a lot of these teams and into a lot of my feelings on where the league might be headed in 2023, go ahead and check that video out. We put a lot of time and effort into that here on this channel, so I would really appreciate it if you guys showed that some love. Obviously, you did when it came out. I hope you continue to do that now, but we are here for week 1. Now, of course, shortened week, LPL, definitely a little bit of a different start to the year here. They've basically got 2 very minuscule, very minor weeks, and then we get Chinese New Year, and then we come back and really start to run into Spring Split. So only 6 series to cover in this video today, but we're going to be going through all 6 of them, talking about the strengths, the weaknesses, giving my player of the series, my dud of the series, and talking about where I think these teams moved in my power rankings. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Let's go ahead and start off with our first series of the year. It's always a fun one to kick off the LPL season with 2 pretty historic franchises, a historic franchise and a former world champion, as we had the first series of the year in the LPL be FPX taking on Team WE. FunPlus Phoenix taking on World Elite, and you know what? WE did it. They pulled out the victory in 3 games here. That is astounding because just remember, look back at last split, just last split. WE went 0-16. They have now ended the drought. They do not start the year 0-1. They start the year 1-0 after not having won an entire series last summer. So huge win for them. And it really was an interesting series. I think, I'm just going to say it, a lot of this win was off the back of their bot lane, which is what we thought we were going to get out of WE in 2023. Had some major question marks about the top side of the map for this team, which is why they ranked number 14 in my power rankings. Also, peep the new slides. Hope you guys enjoy them. They're very similar to what they were last year, just slightly cleaned up. I guess I'll explain on the screen what you guys are seeing if you're not familiar. You'll see all the game scores and who won them in the middle, as well as obviously the teams at the top. But next to them, they have numbers. That's where I power ranked them going into the week. And so you can see WE was at 14, FPX was at 12. Not a huge discrepancy in these power rankings. They were relatively close to being in the same tier, and WE definitely proved that with a win here. And then you can see their scores that they had totaled for the entire series, all 10 players, as well as the champions they played in games 1, 2, and 3. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Like I said, WE's bot lane really coming in clutch. They were the position that really needed to carry this WE roster. They were going to be in a lot, and I mean a lot of trouble, if Hope and Awandi did not step up. BuBu has been incredibly inconsistent, and spoiler alert, that did not change in this series. Hang, relatively unproven, and while he had some good moments in this, it wasn't exactly perfect. And Shanks had a bad year last year. He was really good in 2021 for this WE team that almost made Worlds, but definitely took a step back, really needed to show a lot more. Hope and Awandi were definitely going to be the main focal point for this WE team in terms of roster construction, and that came to fruition in these games. Let's talk about games 1 and 3 first, since we're talking about WE. Game 1 was all Awandi, all the time. He gets on the Nautilus here. We've been talking about how engaged supports are dead, but Awandi proves that wrong. They play Kalista Nautilus, and it looks fantastic. Awandi is everywhere on the map. He's absolutely destroying LWX. And Lele in lane, he's bothering Care all the time in the mid lane, pairing up with Hang very well to take down Haoye in the jungle, and so there's a lot of really good action from Awandi. Spoiler alert, you can already see it up on the screen. Awandi is my player of the series, that's why he's highlighted in green, the first player of the series of the year here in the LPL. He absolutely deserves it. That Nautilus game in game 1 was fantastic, and he also played really well in game number 3 here on the Soraka. Obviously, a little bit more of a supportive role, a little bit more of an enabler on the Soraka. You got to give a ton of credit to Hope, who played really well in that game 3, but Awandi is going to get my nod for player of the series. If you wanted to give it to Hope, I really wouldn't fight you all that much. He was fantastic. He was a little bit less influential in Game 1, but more influential in Game 3, so it's really just kind of where you want to put that. I think both of them were great. The Kalista in Game 1, while it was important, Nautilus was setting absolutely everything up, but the Game 3, long win that WE had, that was all of Aphelios. Once you got to that late game breakpoint, he was doing a ridiculous amount of damage and really started carrying WE from a relatively bad position because of the top side of the map. And so overall, Hope and Awandi looked really, really good. But like I said, not all sunshine and rainbows for WE in this series. Bubu in the top lane wasn't all that good, if I'm being honest. He definitely had his moments of running it down. I'm very anti-Bubu, as you guys know on this channel. He definitely didn't change my mind in this series. Definitely a little bit of a problem, but Hope and Awandi were definitely able to overcome that. Hang, like I said, some little rookie hiccups, but he had really good early games, which is definitely inspiring, especially on that Maokai in game number 1, where it really felt like he was able to do a lot on the map. And then Shanks was good. I think for the most part, other than game 2, he wasn't all that good in game number 2, but in games 1 and 3, I thought he was fine. Definitely not a player that I think is going to be given a ton of resources on WE this year, if the first couple of games are to be believed, but he kind of thrives in that secondary role, and I think he's going to get a lot of good playing time and a lot of good experience in that role this year, with a lot of the attention being drawn bot lane. So overall, I would say pretty good start to the year for WE. Hope and Awandi definitely looking like what they are supposed to. If this WE team wants to contend for playoffs, this is the kind of team that is going to need to show up. But for FPX, not really what you wanted to see. I was down on this team quite a bit going into the year. I had them at number 12. I saw a lot of people, a lot of analysts and casters and everybody having them in the playoffs. I just did not believe in the team like that, and that really came to fruition. This bot lane especially, where I think a lot of the hype for this team was. LWX is a good player. Lele, I thought, was really good coming out of the LDL last year. They got run over by Hope and Awandi. They were simply just not as good. You can really sit there and talk about how it's not entirely their fault, which I do kind of agree with. Obviously, the Caitlyn Lux matchup, you just got to be able to win that, but Awandi got out on the map and was really able to take over. And then the rest of the games were fine. Even the Zeri Lulu, where they were able to win, really wasn't all them. I mean, the Kassadin was so ridiculously strong at that point in the game. You just want to see more out of this FPX bot lane is really what I'm trying to say. Lele is going to get my dud of the series. Always frustrating and unfortunate for a player in his first LPL or major region series to get dud of the series, but Lele just simply got outplayed in this series. Awandi was much, much, much better. We got a great version of Awandi, one that wasn't on LNG last year. Really a lot more similar to that 2021 version, and Lele was not ready to handle that. He got outplayed, especially on that Lux in game number 1, and then also on the Heimerdinger in game number 3. Really wasn't all that good, but if you're looking for a bright spot for FPX, it's really going to be the Kassadin and Care on that Kassadin in the mid lane in game number 2. He really dragged them across the finish line. He got so ridiculously strong in that game that he was able to do a lot of work, and that's definitely going to be an interesting thread. Care really started to develop as the year went on. Last year was really good in their playoff series win at the end of Summer Split, but for the most part, it's just continued to progress. If he can continue doing that, obviously 3 Assassin games here. The 2 Akali games were fine, not really great, not really bad, but the Kassadin game was fantastic. If he can really start to, lock that down, that's going to be a much better focus of winning, I think, for FPX. This team is definitely maybe going to need to move away from its really fast early game tempo play style, I think, with the people that they have. Haoye just got out jungled. There really is no other way to say it. I loved him coming out of the LDL. He was one of my favorite prospects coming out. Him and Leave, obviously, on EDG were probably the 2 I was the most excited about, but he just was not good in this series. The stat line, I think, is a little deceiving. He got out jungled by Hang, both pretty much in every game. Game 2 was okay, but game 1 and 3, he was just not on that same level, and I think that's definitely going to be something that they're going to need to look at. And then Zhao Lao, who, it really didn't matter. He didn't do all that bad. He was better than Bubu in the series, in my opinion, but it never really matters. If you're top lane and you win and the rest of your team loses, you're going to lose the game, and that's kind of what happened to FPX. So where does this leave both teams? Well, for FPX, it's a frustrating loss to start the year, but you've got a lot of games. There's a lot of kinks that I think this team needs to work out. I think mostly their 2 rookies were pretty bad here. Haoye and Lele, you're really relying on them to carry a lot of the weight, and in game number 1, or series number 1 at the very least, they weren't quite up to snuff. I still have a lot of expectations for these 2 to be able to develop, and obviously you're looking for more carry, strong performances from your veteran players. Obviously Care kind of stepped up, but LWX didn't have a good series. You just need this team to gel a lot better. LWX needs to look like spring of 2022 instead of summer 2022, and in Series 1, he just did not quite look at that. Zhao Who was fine. But for FPX, you're just kind of looking for a little bit of a minor improvement, probably from your veterans, and then some stability, hopefully, to come out of those 2 rookie spots. For WE, you're going to be super happy about this win. If Hope and Awandi can get on the same track, if Awandi is a lot closer to 2021, if Hope is really, really clicking and firing, WE is probably going to be better than 14, and they could push for a playoff spot. I did not expect this team to click this well this early, but very, very good series win here, even though there were a few hiccups from Bubu on the top side. You got to give it to WE. A really, really strong start to the year, and a fantastic way to start the LPL in 2023. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1, week 1 LPL action. we had a fun one. Another two set of teams that aren't necessarily locked in the playoff race or conversation facing off here on day number 1 as we had Anyone's Legend taking on Invictus Gaming. And at least for my power rankings, this is a bit of an upset as IG is actually able to take the series 2-0. Big win for an IG team that I was really down on going into the year, and they did it without the player that I thought was going to be the most influential early on in the season. I felt like a lot of this team could grow into something, but Dove was really the only player I looked at this roster on paper having and said, like, well, he might do something now. And they don't even have him. I'm not sure if he's not in the country yet. That has been a problem with LPL players in the past. Obviously, anybody coming over from the LCK to the LPL, it can be tough to get into the country, especially before Chinese New Year. A lot of players just come back after that. Not sure if that's why Nenny is actually playing mid lane in this game. Of course, those of you who know, Nenny is not a mid laner, he's a top laner, and he's supposed to start in the top lane for this team, but luckily for IG, he didn't, because in this series, You Should Know Me, YSKM, whatever you want to call him, was phenomenal. He fills in the top lane, and he looks fantastic. I mean, what a series from a really interesting player. Now, IG has certainly not been afraid to take a gamble on some of these more proactive, carry-oriented top laners in recent memory. Obviously, it started with the Shy, but it moved into Zika a couple of years ago when they acquired him from BLG. Now it's You Should Know Me. I really like this process that IG has of taking players that are really mechanically talented and just seeing if they can make it work in the LPL. You Should Know Me really styled on a lot of players in the PCS, and he's given an opportunity here in the LPL, and it's really working out for him in this first series. He looked fantastic. He really did a lot of good work against a pretty decent player in ZDZ, so very, very good series. He's going to get my player of the series for Invictus Gaming, going from someone who I didn't think they had room for in terms of import rules in the starting lineup to winning player of the series in series number 1. That's going to be super influential. Obviously, a carry-oriented player. You see that in the fact that he picked the Camille, picked the Fiora. Gideon played a lot topside in this game, and honestly, it really, really worked out. There really isn't a lot of complaints. Really, my only worry with him in this series was the fact that if he did make a bad play, he theoretically could have been punished for it, or if ZDZ kind of pivoted to maybe something a little bit more passive, perhaps You Should Know Me really wouldn't have the same kind of ridiculous lead that he got in this series. But even so, the situation as presented itself, he went up against a pretty good top laner, not one that I would consider like a superstar or anything, but someone who's not a pushover at an LPL level, and really just dominated him, was just a lot better. Obviously made some mistakes, was over-aggressive at points, was caught out in some team fights, but for the most part was just really, really good, and in my opinion was the most impactful player in this series. I think the other candidate for player of the series has to be, surprisingly, Wink in the support position. He was fantastic. Game 1 was okay. Varus Lux is kind of an interesting lane, but the Jhin Heimer just did not work out, and so they ended up getting a lot of prio. On was able to get a lot of damage in, and Wink was okay on the Lux, but for the most part, game number 1 was all Camille all the time. But game number 2, that Blitzcrank, I mean, Sword Art and Betty are going to be seeing that Blitzcrank in their nightmares. He was everywhere, not only in the bot lane, but in the mid lane with that Galio as well, just creating a ton of issues for Anyone's Legend to try and solve. Wink is someone who I was really, really low on going into this year. In my opinion, you can make a really solid argument he was the single worst player in the LPL last year. I think that is definitely on the table. And he looked really solid in this series. It definitely looks like he's improved a bit at some of these champions. Obviously, Blitzcrank's kind of a wild pick, but you should know how to play against Blitzcrank if you're a pro player. So the fact that it worked out, really don't blame him too much for picking it. And if he's going to be able to play these more aggressive picks, something that's going to be able to cause a lot of panic, especially all over the map, not only in lane, throughout the entire year, that's a benefit. I mean, Wink has always been a mechanically talented player. Like I said, I did kind of like him back in the day when he was an AD carry prospect coming up with E-Star. He really just kind of fell and fell and fell, and then had pretty much a disastrous 2022 at that support position. Even when he was playing AD carry at the beginning of the year, he wasn't good, and so maybe he's able to turn a corner. This is a really good start to the year and a pretty promising sign. On followed up well. Gideon was okay. Nenny was fine. Like, those two players were there. They weren't necessarily like taking over the game in any way, shape, or form, but it's definitely interesting. Nenny, I didn't even know was a mid lane player. Obviously, he fills in here. I'm not sure if that's just out of necessity or if they would have rather played him over their LDL mid laner. Whatever it ends up being, he plays mid lane. He's fine. Certainly not the focal point, but didn't need to be on 2 games of Rise. And then Gideon was also fine on this Viego. It really was about top lane here with You Should Know Me, and then Wink playing really, really well in game number 2. One thing I want to point out for Invictus Gaming before we move on to Anyone's Legend is that I really am kind of intrigued to see what they're going to do over the next, few weeks if Dove does come back, because it is worth noting that You Should Know Me and Gideon are both imports, and so is Dove. And so if Dove is going to come into this lineup at any position, in any way, if he's going to come in mid lane, he's going to have to replace one of those two. You're either going to have to take You Should Know Me out and move Nenny back to top lane, or you're going to have to take Gideon out and bring in your LDL jungler, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. But either way, it's definitely interesting. This was a pretty clear-cut decision at the beginning of the year that Nenny was going to be playing in the top lane and that Dove was going to be playing in the mid lane, but You Should Know Me certainly going to make it a conversation. It'll be interesting to see if he gets more playing time, even with the import restriction kind of being a little bit of an issue for this Invictus Gaming team. But moving on to Anyone's Legend, not a good way to start the season. I really don't have a lot of good things to say about this team. They looked really bad in this series. Most specifically, their mid and their support just got completely outplayed. Top lane, I already talked about a bit. ZDZ was not nearly on the same level as You Should Know Me in the series. He took that kind of carry versus carry matchup in both games, the Fiora Camille kind of switch, and lost both times, and that's not a good sign. He had a really good, I don't want to say breakout because he wasn't a superstar or anything, but kind of solidifying year in the LPL last year with Anyone's Legend, especially towards the beginning. I thought he was going to be able to carry that momentum moving into 2023, but perhaps it was a little bit too early to jump the gun on calling him kind of a consistent force in the top lane after just one split, because he did not look good against a player who really is not all that proven. Perhaps he is good, but we don't really know that yet, so it's interesting to see CDZ really take a big hammering here, but you've also got Sword Art coming in. We talked about this. Betty and Sword Art kind of reuniting from that Flash Wolves days. They really needed to click. I talked about this a lot with AL. Betty was a big part of that team's win streak early on last year. Obviously not the biggest. Xiao Hao was definitely the biggest part, but Betty being able to clean up a lot of those team fights later in the game and being really consistent was a big reason AL was kind of in that playoff picture for a while. Bringing in Sword Art was supposed to solidify that a tad bit more, but Sword Art was awful in this series. The Heimerdinger is just not working out so far in pro play in the LPL. Obviously that could change. It worked really well at Worlds, but it seems teams have definitely labbed against it going into the season. Teams are prepared to face this perma push kind of Heimerdinger style with, kind of a more passive AD carry, something like a Jhin in this instance, and teams are prepared to beat it, which they absolutely did in game number 1. They pivot over to the Varus, which is kind of the standard, I would say, AD carry in the meta right now, the one that I would consider to be the most, I don't want to say like picker ban, but the most like fluctuating, and they're really not able to do much there either. Sword Art was just generally bad in this series, outplayed by Wink, and if you would have told me before the series that Sword Art would have been outplayed by Wink, that would not have been a good sign. And then I got to give dud of the series to Harder in just completely outclassed. They did sign Pins, who I'm actually super high on. I talked about him, I think, a bit in my preseason power rankings video when I was talking about Ching on Ultra Prime. Obviously, the former mid laner for FPX Blaze ended up moving on BLG's LDL team, and he was really good. I actually really liked him as a player. I really liked what I saw out of him in the tape there, and so he's likely going to play, I think, whenever they end up getting him accustomed to playing with the rest of the team. But Harder is playing in this game, and he just got outclassed. He's playing against a substitute mid laner in Nenny, who's playing Ryze both games, and he's really not able to create any pressure on the map in either. Plays this more supportive style here. Syndra in game 1 had a little bit of damage, but not nearly enough to make it worthwhile, and then the Galio in game 2 was absolutely brutal. He just got picked on the entire game by that Blitzcrank roaming around mid lane, and so overall, not a good series for Harder, and really not a good series for Anyone's Legend. Really the only player on the team that I could say had any sort of proactivity was Xiao Hao, which is kind of what we were saying about this team towards the back half of last year as well. Xiao Hao was fantastic for Anyone's Legend, but there's only so much that you can do when the rest of the team around you is really struggling, and that feels like what AL is right now. Perhaps putting them at 10 was significantly too high. I just had a lot of faith in that jungle position, and I really thought Sword Art was going to be an upgrade to this team, but it's really looking like it might be the opposite. Maybe when Pins comes in, you get a little bit more consistency out of that mid lane. Perhaps that could be a bit of a better circumstance, but if the spot lane continues to be a problem, AL is going to continue to struggle to win games. They are definitely going to be falling in my power rankings after this performance, and IG is going to be moving up them. It's interesting to see where this team is going to be headed. Obviously, I don't feel entirely confident to say that they're like anywhere near playoffs at the moment, because this team definitely has a lot to prove still. They're not even playing with their full roster yet, or are they? I don't know. I have no idea what this team is going to do, so until we figure that out, it's going to be still a little bit TBD for IG, but this is a great showing to start off the year. You Should Know Me looked fantastic, and if he's able to carry that in, that's great. If On and Wink are anything better than the worst bot lane in the LPL, that is a huge improvement over what this team was last year, and if you get both of those things happening, perhaps Gideon and then whoever you're playing in the mid lane can be a little bit more substantial in their roles, maybe not problems, just kind of be there like they were in this series. IG is going to significantly outperform this number 17 spot. They're showing a lot more promise than I expected them to have going into the season, and IG fans have to be really excited about that. Moving on to our third series here of day number 1 action. We finally had a matchup between two teams that are really looking good on paper. We finally got to see two teams that are very exciting in action, and that was a matchup between Bilibili Gaming and JD Gaming. Definitely two teams that are very much looked at as world's contenders at the very least. I have JDG at number 1 in my power rankings, BLG at number 5, not too far out of that either. And so both teams really looking to prove that their new look rosters, because both made some big changes, are moving in the right direction. And I'd have to say, even with JDG winning this, I think both teams definitely accomplished that goal. This was a super fun series to watch between two very good League of Legends teams and some very good League of Legends players. JDG ends up pulling it out 2-1 in game number 3. Pretty back and forth contest. This was kind of a battle between two players in particular, and that is Ruler on the side of JD Gaming and Bin on the side of Bilibili Gaming. I talked about both of them extensively going into the year. Bin was my shining light of BLG last year, as we all knew. He was fantastic on that team, but no one else was following up on some of his great plays. And then everybody knows how I feel about this JDG team, specifically Ruler, who I gave, my no-brainer LCK MVP last year. He comes over to the LPL. A lot of people are kind of wondering whether or not he's still going to be the player that he was in the LCK. Spoiler alert, he is. He gets his first penta in the LPL here in game number 3. He almost got his first penta in the LPL in game number 1, but On would not give it to him on the Lulu. He does give it to him in game number 3 on the Ashe when Ruler's on that Varus. And I mean, what can you say? Ruler looked fantastic in this series. It wasn't just him, but he really showed why I felt so comfortable calling him the best AD carry in the LPL, kind of taking that mantle from Viper as he heads back to the LCK. And that's because he's just so much more aggressive than any other AD carry in this region. While he wasn't perfect in this series by any means, he certainly showed why he's able to change games more often than a lot of the other AD carries in the meta. I know a lot of people are talking about how Ruler was maybe a little overhyped, quote-unquote, in this series where he was good, but maybe not as good as his stats would show. I would argue that his aggressive mentality, even though it cost him a little bit in some of these games, kind of walking straight into June as he stopwatched only to get Wukong ulted, was definitely, one of the positioning mistakes on the radar. Those aggressive plays, that aggressive mentality, that willingness to risk putting yourself in a bad position to do a boatload of damage in team fights, that is what top tier AD carries do. It's just what they do. It's what they've always done. Your job is to get damage out. Your job, for the most part, is not to just live no matter what, because especially in a team comp like this, in both Game 1 and Game 3, but most specifically Game 3, you have damage outside of Ruler. If he can go up and get a ton of damage in on that Varus, can really shred the beginning part of that fight. Even if he gets taken out, then you've got Knight to follow up on the Syndra, you've got 369 on the Jace, hell, even missing on the Heimerdinger, can do a significant amount of damage against a relatively squishy comp on the side of BLG. And so playing aggressive, that's really what I want to see out of Ruler. He played with no fear, which is really what I like to see, and for that, he's going to get my player of the series. Gotta give a huge shout out to Knight. I almost gave this to Knight. I know I'm a little bit of a homer for Knight. People on this channel know I love Knight as a player. I think he's arguably the best player in the world, and I still think he's underrated. I don't think he gets the kind of credit he deserves, and that is especially true for how he played in this series. He was fantastic. I think you can make a case that he was the most consistent player on both teams in this series, maybe outside of Bin, who was great and consistent, but Knight was really, really, really good. That Akali game in Game 1 was fine. Game 2 on the Lissandra, wasn't able to carry. Obviously, it's the Lissandra, and, Bin kind of took over that game on the Gnar. Those engages were definitely a problem. But game number 3 on the Syndra was stellar. I mean, actively stellar. His mechanics and his reaction times are just unparalleled to pretty much anybody else that I've watched play League of Legends at this level. So Knight's fantastic. What else what else is new, right? Missing and Kanavi were good. Missing was pretty solid, I would say, in the first couple of games. The Heimerdinger one definitely had some moments. Don't love the pick. I'm starting to get a little bit like, I can see where this could become a problem if teams just start AFK picking Heimer and just hoping that it works. A lot of teams really seem to have good game plans against it, and it hasn't been perfect. And so missing outside of that I thought was pretty good. And then Kanavi was fine. Certainly didn't have the same kind of control that he normally would have had in a series last year, but this series was all about mid and ADC, the two new acquisitions for JDG. So Kanavi taking a back seat was certainly not a problem. Do want to point out 369. Not going to hit the panic button or anything just yet, but he was pretty bad in this series. He definitely got completely run over by Bin in the top lane, which is not exactly what you want to see out of 369. He had such a great bounce back year last year, was the best top laner in the LPL all year long, basically, and you could make an argument one of the best in the world, only really behind Zeus, and so really had high expectations for him going into this year, but this definitely looked more like Top Esports 369 rather than it did JDG 369. This is kind of something that you've always gotten with him. He's always been at least a little bit inconsistent, but you're kind of hoping for him to clean up a lot of those mistakes. As for BLG, even though they lost the series, I actually have a lot of faith that this team is going to be able to turn it around, and most specifically because of two players. Already talked extensively about Ben. He hard carried game number 2 on that Gnar, absolutely obliterated JDG, almost gave him player of the series, honestly. If BLG had all won this, Ben would be getting player of the week, player of the series kind of, nominations, because he really was the guy on this team that was carrying them, but gotta give a lot of credit to Elk as well, who I think played really fantastic in this series. His positioning was basically immaculate, was never really in range to be done damage to, and actually got a lot of damage out in these team fights. Those two players were keeping BLG in this by a considerable margin. Elk, obviously someone who I've been very high on this channel, even when he was on Ultra Prime last year. Go watch some of my spring videos before that team really fell apart, and you'll see how highly I talk about Elk. I talk about it as Elk and 9 wards, including the enemy team, because he can only do so much, but he's finally on a team where I think some of his other players are performing, and he really, really looked like 2021 WE Elk rather than 2022 Ultra Prime Elk in this game, and if you're getting that, that's why I feel pretty good about BLG in the long run, but the rest of the team, not perfect. On wasn't bad. I don't want to group On in that. On was fine. Him and Elk actually played really well in the bot lane 2v2. He wasn't perfect in team fights. But the real concern, I would say, for BLG, at least in comparison to facing some top teams, is going to be this jungle mid duo of Jun and Yagao, who just were both pretty bad in this series. They were probably the biggest reason why BLG was not able to win, is they inted harder than 369 did on JDG. And so that's unfortunate. Yagao's actually going to get my dud of the series here. He just got run over by Knight in lane, out of lane. Golly, his Ahri was awful in team fights. He was doing no damage. He was missing every single charm. I just did not like this gameplay from Yagao. I don't really know what happened. It felt like he was still playing for JDG in this series, but this was definitely not 2022 Yagao. He played these champions pretty immaculately last year, and maybe it's losing Kanavi, maybe it's just new team jitters, and he might be able to get it back. I don't want to overreact to one series, but he was really bad in this series, and that's not a good sign. Jun was in a similar boat, had some good engages on the Wukong, but man, did he just run it down, over and over and over again. Sometimes that's what you have to do on champions like Wukong and Vi, is just engage with no brain, but it didn't necessarily work out for BLG. I was concerned about him going into the season. Those haven't exactly been alleviated in this series, but overall, pretty decent series from both teams. Ben looked like an absolute monster, and Elk looks like he's back on track, even if BLG didn't win. The series, overall, I still think they looked pretty okay. And then JDG picking up a win purely based off the fact that their team is just better. Knight and Ruler look absolutely fantastic. The two new acquisitions really coming in and making JDG their home. If there is a little bit of a concern, it's the fact that some of the more, the retained players, I would say, on JDG didn't necessarily live up to the billing in this one. 369 was awful, and Kanavi wasn't really all that good either, even when Jun was struggling, but they're talented enough where I don't want to pull the trigger on them just yet. I feel like they have plenty of time to turn it around and prove to me that they can be that. It's just one series against BLG, but overall, if you're looking for a positive for JDG, it's the carries are really, really carrying, and if you get that all year long, this really is going to be the best team in the LPL. Moving on to our first series here of day number 2 in week 1 action. We had another matchup between two teams that are kind of lower on expectations, at least in my opinion, than a lot of the rest of the league. A lot of the bottom teams kind of kicking it out here in week 1, as we had a matchup between LGD Gaming and Rare Adam, that Rare Adam is able to take after a pretty commanding game 1 loss. Not really used to seeing that, obviously. We saw a similar situation last year with Invictus Gaming, I believe, losing a series after Perfect Gaming Anyone's Legend early in the year. I believe that's correct. I mean, someone in the comments will tell me, but that's a memory I seem to have, and that was kind of similar to what happened here, a 17-0 game 1 win for LGD off the back of Meteor's Skarner, which was fantastic. Really hyped up Meteor going into the year. Really good to see him back in the LPL. He played great not only in game 1 but the whole series, but really was not enough to beat RA, who were able to take game 2 and game 3 off of the back of a Jax pick that I am incredibly surprised was let through in both games, especially after how it went in game number 2. Cube is going to get my player of the series for Rare Adam. Game 1 was fine for him. He really wasn't all that bad, but games 2 and 3, I can't believe they gave him Jax twice. He really took over this map. He made that champion look incredibly unbalanced against a very auto-attack reliant team. And it really just shows the power of that pick. Jax is really something we've seen fall in and out of pro play meta over the past few years. Always been something that's been a little bit too aggressive for a lot of teams to pick up. But when you see something like an Aatrox, yeah, go ahead and swing that. I mean, into Fiora, yeah, go ahead and swing that. If you're the better player, you can win those matchups. And Cube was certainly the better player in this series. Really hyped him up coming into the year. It's been an incredibly stable force for Rare Atom and definitely showed up in their first series of the year. Want to give a ton of credit to Leon as well. Really had a lot of impact in these games, even when he was getting deficits in the early game. With the exception of game number 1 on the Viego, he went to some more safe, I would say, early picks here in the Sejuani and the Vi, and he was able to make use of that. He was able to create a lot of map states that were really positive for RA overall. Strive was really good, especially on that Syndra in game number 3. Really liked how he played, but for the most part, this was the Cube show for Rare Atom. Gotta talk about it a bit. Southwind was really, really garbage in this series and almost gave him the dud of the series. I mean, there was a real possibility that he was the worst player out of these 10, but it's just kind of difficult. I don't really like pulling the trigger on giving dud of the series to a winning team player, but Southwind was not good, and that's certainly a problem. Southwind has been someone who has been a little bit of a nuisance to his own team in the past, and was someone I was worried about on this Rare Atom team going into the year. Those fears haven't exactly been alleviated because of this game. Awesome looked okay here, especially on that Zeri in game number 2, where he was really given free reign to kind of just play around, especially with that Jax, them having to devote so many resources to really being able to deal with him. They have a ton of peel here. You have Lulu, you have Sejuani. That Zeri was really able to kind of run amok in the backline, and he looked good in that game. But for the most part, like I said, topside focused comp and a topside focused win here for Rare Atom, even if Southwind wasn't exactly holding up his end of the bargain. For LGD, I said this earlier, game 1, absolute stomp off the back of Meteor, playing really, really well. I also want to give a big shout out here to Haichao, who I didn't actually expect to be playing. It's okay that he's playing. I don't think he has nearly as high of a ceiling as a player like XQW, who I actually do think is a pretty solid player. But he was pretty good in game number 1 on this Rise. Wasn't exactly super game-defining in either 2 or 3. Wasn't a problem for this team. The problem, for the most part, was just top lane just getting absolutely brutalized. Aggressive matchups are in the top lane. That's what we're seeing out of the LPL so far. Maybe it's an LPL thing. Obviously, we know that they are particularly partial to picks like Fiora and Jax and Camille, and so perhaps that might just be more of a LPL thing, but so far we've seen a lot of aggressive top lane matchups, and it really does show that the more mechanically talented top laner can typically win. In this case, that was Cube, and the less mechanically talented top laner will lose. In this case, that was Xiaoshu, who was not good in this series. He's going to get my dud of the series. I said this earlier, it's always tough when in your rookie debut for a franchise, you get dud of the series, but he just kind of got outclassed in that top lane matchup. His hands were just worse. There's really no other way to put it. I think you could really make that case that that's kind of the prevailing overarching kind of narrative for this series for LGD versus Rare Atom in general, is the fact that Rare Atom just had really good hands in this series. They made some, let's call them decisions throughout the series, but they were able to win because they are just better. They were better in these team fights. They were better at taking advantage of some of the opportunities that the other team gave them. LGD just weren't in that position, and really, frankly, I didn't expect them to be. This was a series that I expected them to lose. So for them to come out in game number 1 looking pretty okay, you're going to take some advantages out of that. LPC and Jinzhao were fine. LPC actually showed some interesting things on that Zeri in game number 1. Unfortunately, he was never really given an opportunity to kind of show that off again after that first game. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see where this LGD, it's kind of hard to say that fast, team moves as we move on throughout the year. I don't think they're nearly that as some of the other power rankings that have come out, maybe by other analysts, would lead you to believe. I think Meteor is a pretty solid player, and I think he kind of got a little bit team gapped, whatever you want to say, in this series. Meteor was actually pretty good, liked how he played, and I think LPC is competent. Haichou showed some interesting things. Jinzhao and Xiaoshu, not exactly standout players in any stretch, but maybe they can grow. Xiaoshu especially, perhaps he has some sort of upside. Overall, LGD, not a playoff team, certainly not someone who's going to be contending, but far from a team that just has like absolutely nothing. And they kind of showed, I think, what they're probably going to show themselves to be all year long in this series. For Rare Atom, it's a good win to get. Cube looks really good. He's kind of the big solid for this team. You'd really like to see this bot lane come together a tad bit more. Awesome has really good hands. Southwind is holding him back just a tad bit in this series. Hopefully that's not a continuous trend. Awesome kind of had a similar experience last year with Jinzhao on this LGD team, and so it'll be interesting. Hopefully he just doesn't get support, purgatoried again. This RA team, I talked about it in their preview, has kind of just never been able to find a competent support. But topside was good. Cube was good. Leon was good. Strive definitely had his moments, especially in game number 3. That's what you want to see out of Rare Adam. You want to see them be able to beat a team like LGD, especially just doing it by basically out-talenting them. You want to see some macro improvements, but for the most part, this is everything you wanted to see out of an RA victory, especially coming back from 0-2. Jumping into our second series here of day 2, we had an interesting one. We've had a few kind of interesting back and forth series, but this was one I was really excited for on paper, and it delivered in a sense. It certainly was an entertaining series, if nothing else, and that was OMG taking on RNG. Oh my god, taking on Royal Never Give Up. And RNG is able to pick up the 2-0 victory, which makes you think that maybe it wasn't quite a fun series. Maybe RNG kind of controlled the tempo, and for game 1, that definitely was the case. It was all RNG all the time in game number 1, but man, game number 2 was brutal to watch if you were cheering for OMG, because everything just seemingly went wrong for that team. Let's talk about the series overall. Obviously, we always start with the winning team, and we're going to start with RNG here. Who was really good in this series? Well, I think a lot of people are going to talk about Breathe as kind of the main guy in this series, and we'll get to Breathe. Breathe was very good in game 2 on that Camille. Obviously, he wins game 2 with a backdoor push on the Camille. We will talk about it, but I'm going to give my player of the series here to Gala in the bot lane. He was sensational. Gala, I feel like, is someone who I'm not often right in line with how people typically view players. I'm not often I'm usually higher or lower in some area than most people. I feel like I'm dead on with Gala with pretty much everybody else. He's a super good AD carry. He may not be top 1, 2, or 3 in the world, but he's in the case for top 5. And he plays like it all the time. He's super consistent. He's going to win your team games no matter who he's got around him. And he's just a really, really mechanically talented player that does occasionally pull out that X factor. And I think he really was that in game number 1 here on the Zeri, where he was fantastic. It was the best game of the series by any player. That's a big reason why he is going to get my player of the series, but it's not like he was bad in game number 2 either on that champion. Really, when you're able to pilot someone like Zeri at an optimal level, when you're able to stay out of trouble, able to continuously poke in these teamfights, really whittle them down for carries like Viego to be able to clean up towards the back half, especially if you have something like a Yumi and even a Lissandra in that game number 2 that's going to be able to facilitate that a bit easier. I mean, those teamfights are basically unwinnable unless you mess up, or unlosable, I should say, unless you mess up on the side of RNG. And Gala certainly was not going to mess up in those teamfights. It wasn't perfect. Game number 2 certainly wasn't. Game number 1 was. Game number 1 was an absolute stomp, an absolute blowout. Love the draft. I don't usually talk about draft, especially in these weekly game reviews, because I don't want to spend too much time on each of these series, but I want to give a big shout out to the Graves pick in game number 1. We're seeing a lot of Vi still continuously come out. I think Vi is a very overrated champion in terms of her accessibility in these games. We're seeing a lot of blind pick Vi into Zeri just because you can point and click on her for the ultimate. But the problem with that is it opens up the door for something like a Graves, which Wei does go to in game number 1 as a counter pick. Love this idea in general for draft because, yeah, Vi's going to be able to point and click on Zeri, but Graves is going to be up 50 CS and he's going to be doing a billion damage in the late game. Do you really want to spend your jungle pick to become a relatively irrelevant version of Graves in the late game where he's just going to be able to run shop if you do target the Zeri? That's kind of what happened in game number 1. Really like that draft ideology, and I hope more teams kind of pull that out. I think Vi will slowly start to fall out of popularity as we move on throughout the split, but that's just kind of an observation I had. I think this kind of idea of aggressive top, kind of quote-unquote carry, but more like follow-up jungler, like a jungler who's maybe not going to be like a primary resource hogger, but someone who in these team fights is going to be able to do that secondary level of damage if the team full commits to the AD carry along with a more supportive mid. That definitely works for RNG. Obviously, neither of these teams have their full rosters in. I should talk about that. Tongyuan and, yeah, Tongyuan is in for RNG. I was going to say and Bunny, but Bunny right now, as we know of, is the starter. But Tongyuan is not. Angel wasn't in. I don't think he's allowed to play, and it's the same thing with PP God until week 2 because of the registration rules, because of when they were signed. They were not signed in time to be able to play in week 1, so both teams missing a starter in this game, but with that backup mid, you really invested a lot more into that bot lane, and I think it really worked out. Gallo was fantastic. And then Breathe. Breathe, yes, he was fantastic in game number 2. You can talk about the fact that he, won the game for them with that backdoor. He was really doing a lot of damage in the back half of that laning phase with the Camille, but let's remember that early on in that game, for a good portion of the early part of that laning phase, he was losing. He was losing to the Gwen on the Camilo matchup. He really should not be losing in any respect, but he does kind of roam down into a fight in river, gets a kill, is able to go back up, has enough pressure then to be able to kill Shanji, and from that point, the lane is over. Breathe does a really good job of transitioning his lead. I hope he's able to keep that up. He was really good last year, almost underratedly good last year. I saw a lot of people talking about him as like an overrated player after the 2022 season. I think he just didn't get a lot of resources. RNG has always liked to play more towards the bot side. I don't expect that to change all that much this year, even with Xiaohu gone. Breathe being in that top lane was able to get quite a bit in game number 2 here, but definitely more of an extraneous circumstance with Tang Yuan in the mid lane. He was good, just not great. Wei was really good. I really liked him. And Bunny was honestly pretty interesting. I really don't have a lot of knowledge or information about Bunny. You're gonna have to go pretty far back to find like a consistent time where Bunny played more than just a couple of games. And so it's interesting for him to come in here and play. He's obviously been in the RNG system forever. I put Ming in my power rankings graphic, and that was mostly for the fact that it really does feel like Ming is going to be back here. It feels like he's kind of contract held, and if he wants to play, he's going to have to play on RNG, and I really don't see a reason why he wouldn't play on RNG. But if he doesn't play, Bunny seems to be a fairly decent replacement or substitute for the impact that Ming is. He's obviously not going to be Ming. He will never be Ming, but Bunny is okay. He's not a bad player, and he was fine in the series. Him and Gala seem to have relatively good chemistry, although it's just Zeri Yumi. It's hard to take away too much. On the side of OMG, though, interesting series. I actually really liked some of the plays that they were able to make in the early game. Shanji did a really good job of fighting Breathe early, he just couldn't maintain it. He got super mental boomed once he died, and he's unfortunately going to get my dud of the series for it. He wasn't good in game number 1, but game number 2, when he started out with that lead, if he just kind of kept that, if he was able to keep his foot on the gas and not, really start to lose that pressure, I think we're talking about game 2 as an OMG win, and we're talking about a game 3 in this series. He was not able to do that, unfortunately, and then he gets backdoored. You can talk about how OMG was able to win some of the team fights towards the back half of that game. Abel was actually playing pretty well on the Lucian in some of these late game team fights, and I thought Cream did a really good job on the Rise, especially dealing damage in the back half of game number 2. The only unfortunate part is I think you really could fault Cream for not teleporting back to base when Breathe was taking the Nexus. That was probably something he should have done once he won that team fight, but outside of that, I mean, it just felt like a team that was slightly outclassed. They didn't feel like they were run over. I mean, in game 1 they were, but that was mostly because Gala just went off. In game number 2, honestly, for a lot of it, it felt like they were the better team. And so for them to lose game number 2, it's got to feel at least a little bit frustrating. But, it's RNG. This isn't a bad team by any means. Breathe, Wei, and Gala, even with 2 kind of more inexperienced players on the team, are 3 of the best players that the LPL has to offer. Losing to them is certainly not a problem. You just hope that they were able to clean up some of the mistakes. Cream has definitely been criticized for his ability to play champions that are outside of that assassin comfort zone. I thought he was really good on the Rise in game number 2 here. We're not going to be sure how long that champion's going to be at all relevant, but, if he's able to get picks like that, I'm really not all that worried. I'm much higher on Cream than the consensus is. I think he's pretty underrated on champions that aren't those assassins, and I think he's going to prove that throughout the year. Abel was okay. Jerry was okay, but they're going to get PP God back soon. Shanji just needs to not mental boom. I really think this was just kind of an extra circumstance for him, and so it's really hard to take away too much from this series outside of the fact that OMG just simply was slightly worse than RNG in that game number 2, if not slightly better. They just weren't able to finish it off, and RNG kind of scrapes away by the skin of their teeth in that game 2. I'm sure they would have won a game 3, but it's hard to really know, and so good win for RNG. Not the worst loss in the world for a team like OMG. Both teams are probably going to say, okay, we had our week number 1, but it's really not going to define our season, and what happens after this, I think, is really going to define what direction both of these teams go in. That's going to bring us to our 6th and final series in week number 1 here in the LPL. And it's a good one. Definitely an intriguing series between 2 teams that, well, maybe not close in the power rankings, certainly have some things that they want to prove here to open up the season. We had Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Ultra Prime, and Ninjas in Pyjamas is going to take the victory here. No surprise, really, in the grand scheme of things. Ninjas in Pyjamas are the better team, and they should have been able to pick up the victory, but it was, in my opinion, a lot more convincing than I expected it to be. I thought Ultra Prime would at least put up a little bit of a fight, but man, did they not in this series. Ninjas in Pyjamas, I'm just going to call them NIP, or NIP. I don't like saying NIP. It feels weird. It feels like I shouldn't be saying that on YouTube. I'll get demonetized, so NIP, for the most part, was pretty good in this series. It's pretty much exactly what you wanted to see. They took advantage of a lot of Ultra Prime's mistakes, which I think is really what you wanted to see a team like NIP really do towards the beginning of this season. A player of the series for me was between 2 players. I ended up giving it to Fodic there in the bottom lane. he was really good, although he was way too aggressive. It's hard for me to say that when I just talked about Ruler a couple of series ago and how he was so good for being aggressive. Yes, he would put his team in a position where they really would have to pick up at least a little bit of the pace, but for the most part, he trusted his team, and the team comp was built around the fact that if he died early, at least if he got some damage out, he had some players that could clean up, right? Not as much with something like a Rise in the mid lane, but for the most part, Photic was still good. He was fantastic in game number 1 in particular. Game number 2, a little bit more of the Xiaolin Bao show. I was actually very close to giving Xiaolin Bao the player of the series here. Those two were really the big carries, quote-unquote, for NIP. Xiaolin Bao and Photic, both returning from the team last year, and both playing really, really, really well in this series. If those two can get on the same page like they did in this series, if Photic can continue to grow as a player, obviously, he did a great job last year at being able to take down worse teams. That was really the thing that I think Photic excelled at the most, was when he was, like, significantly better than the player he was playing against, he beat them badly. He did really, really well when he had a skill advantage. Now, obviously, still a lot to show me when he's at a relative skill, maybe not deficit, but like a neutrality. Doesn't always play perfect from neutral, but he played really, really well with the advantage again in this series, and he really looked good. Juo, 2 games of Yuumi. I was a little bit worried about him and Photic's, synergy, at least from what we saw the last time they played together moving into the season, but they looked okay in this series. Certainly not something that I'm going to freak out over. Obviously, it's a Zeri Yuumi. I can only glean so much from 2 games of Zeri Yuumi, but Photic was given a lot of the resources, and he ended up paying them off for NIP. Xiaolin Bao was the one to kind of initiate a lot of those resources. Man, did he just completely control the map. I just talked in the last series about how I don't think Vi was a particularly fantastic pick. He picks it twice in this series, both into Wukong, and it really worked out. Obviously, a takeaway not into Zeri, and it doesn't seem like Ning really wanted to pull out something like a Graves, something that could just power farm and try to win in these late-game teamfights. It really wasn't going to work anyways. Ultra Prime was losing too hard to contest a lot of these late-game teamfights anyways, but Xiaolin Bao controlled so much of this map on the Vi. It was really difficult for pretty much anybody in the game on the side of Ultra Prime to be able to do anything. Now, a lot of problems were stemmed from their early games, which we'll get to when we talk about the team, but Xiaolin Bao did a great job of controlling that. Invincible was in here. Really the only kind of quote-unquote not normal piece that we're going to see. Rich is starting for NIP, but he will not be back until after Lunar New Year. I believe that to be the case. That's what he tweeted out, so I hope that's true. Either way, Invincible is going to be playing for at least a little bit here. Talked about him in my power rankings. You guys know where I stand on him. He's basically exactly what I thought he was in this series, going up against Harry, who's just not the same kind of opponent. And then Dream was there. He got 2 games of Rise. It was fine. Both of these games, I should point out before we get too far in, were salty runbacks. Game number 1 was relatively close until a teamfight just didn't go the way of Ultra Prime, and then NIP was really able to take over for the rest of the game. Clearly, Ultra Prime just saw that and was like, okay, well, if we get it back, if we run back the same thing, then we can actually win game number 2. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. They ran it back, and they lost game 2 even harder. Not exactly the drafting strategy you want, but NIP certainly did their job, and they looked pretty good in this series. As for Ultra Prime, one player looked good on the team, which was Ning. I thought he was okay on 2 games of Wukong. It certainly could have been worse. He really got out-pressured by Xiaolin Bao, but most of that was the fact that he had absolutely 0 assistance from his laners, most notably his solo laners, who were always pushed into their tower. He had absolutely no priority on the map, and so Xiaolin Bao just kind of got to do whatever he wanted. But Ning actually played some of these teamfights relatively okay. I liked his engages on the Wukong. That's kind of the important part of playing Wukong, is making sure that you engage at the right time. He did set his team up for some interesting predicaments, but really this entire draft is centered on the fact that you need your bot lane to play well. And their bot lane, spoiler alert, did not play well. Doggo and Baolan were atrocious. They were really, really bad. I mean, let's take away the level 1 mishap that caused them to get super far behind, and let's just talk about what they were able to do from that point onwards. Lucian Nami is a lane that needs to be pressuring. It needs to be able to create its own advantages. It needs to be able to take advantage of that mid-game power spike that it's able to have around 8 to 10 minutes once you hit that first completed item. And man, did they just not do that. Doggo looked atrocious in this series, and Baolan somehow looked worse. Baolan's going to be my dud of the series here. Was a little bit of hype surrounding this team because you had 2 former IG World Champions coming in Ning and Baolan. It certainly looks like they haven't played in a year, and hopefully that doesn't continue. This bot lane was very, very bad. If Ultra Prime can't get any good performances out of these 2, that's definitely going to be an issue for this team moving forward. It's not like their solo laners really picked up any of the slack. Harry and Ching were both also bad. Harry was completely destroyed in that top lane playing the Cassante. He looked like me playing the Cassante in solo queue, which is to say, completely useless. Kind of expected that. Didn't really see a ton out of him as a player. He had a little bit of LPL experience, so I ranked him a little bit higher than some of the other players who didn't, but really don't expect him to ever be a superstar. And I was much lower on Ching than anybody else coming into the year in that mid lane spot. He had a really good playoff run for FPX Blaze, but he wasn't all that interesting in the regular season. He replaced Pins, who I really liked on FPX Blaze, and I thought he was a slightly worse prospect coming in. I don't really see a lot of hope for this Ultra Prime team. They're probably going to fall in the power rankings, and when you're already sitting at 15 and looking like you're going to fall even further beyond that, that is never a good sign. This bot lane has to turn around. These solo laners have to be anything but a complete travesty like they were in this series, and you really just got to hope for something to change. I think I'm not really holding my hat on that. I really don't think this Ultra Prime team is in for a pretty good split, but you know, obviously a lot can turn around. It's only the first series. And then for NIP, this is a really good start to the year. You wanted to get a good performance out of Photic. You put them on something comfortable. Dream played that more supportive role really, really well. That's what he did well at the beginning of last year in the spring split. And Zhao and Bao looked fantastic. This is the kind of performance that you're really hoping that you're going to be able to get out of him all split long. Obviously, once you get Rich back, you're going to get a little bit more consistency in those team fights. NIP looks pretty good. I know it's against a pretty bad team in Ultra Prime, not exactly the pinnacle of competition, but at the very least, you wanted to see this team be able to come out and definitively be able to beat a lower tier team, and they absolutely did that. If this was a team that was ranked higher than 9th, just based off of the talent, especially once they get Rich back, I really wouldn't be all that surprised, but it's hard to really gauge how good you are when you just destroy a team that clearly is in complete dysfunction like Ultra Prime is. All right, that is going to do it for my LPL Week 1 overview and analysis. Up on the screen right now, you are going to see the updated LPL standings. Of course, not very concrete, only, most of the league played. Not everybody in the league played, and even then, it was only one series, so not the most defined of standings, but you're going to see everybody ranked either 1st, 4th, 7th, 12th, or 15th, depending on how they won, if they won, how they lost, or if they lost, etc., etc. In the first column, you're going to see my updated power rankings for the team. So you'll see Invictus Gaming sitting in first place in the standings, has a power ranking of 14. That means I have them number 14 in my power rankings. Next to that, you're going to see the change, how that has changed from last week to this week, from the preseason to after week 1, of course, their record and then their current streak. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. Really, a lot of risers this week. Two biggest risers are a tie. Invictus Gaming jumping from last place, number 17, to number 14. That's a pretty big jump, obviously. Some people might rank them higher. They're definitely not a playoff team confirmed or anything like that. To me, they beat up on a team that I really don't like, as you see from how much they've fallen. I liked them in the preseason, but they showed absolutely nothing in that series, and so they fall. And then WE jumping from number 14 to number 11, also going to be my biggest riser of the week. Both of them jumping up 3 spots. WE's bot lane looks legit. If they can carry that on, that might be a team that really does straddle the line between that and playoffs. Other risers, I guess. Thunder Talk, having not played a game, rises up to number 10 because Anyone's Legend does drop down. And then Rare Atom jumps up to number 12. They looked pretty good in their win this week as well. Fallers, FPX drops 1, LGD drops 1, Ultra Prime drops 1, and then Anyone's Legend drops all the way down to number 15 from number 10. They're going to need to completely rearrange my mental here. This team was a team that I really liked on paper because I thought ZDZ and Xiao Hao were a lot better than maybe they're going to be this year. Xiao Hao I still think is a very good player. I think he might just be a little elo locked here on Anyone's Legend. ZDZ got absolutely punished this week, and that bot lane looked like a problem. Obviously, hopefully Pins can come in. They just recently signed him, and he can be a little bit of an upgrade in the mid lane. But for now, Anyone's Legend's going to drop down to number 15, a team that I don't really see in the playoff picture the way things stand after they played their first series. But that brings us to my player of the week and my dud of the week that I give out every single week. So player of the week for me in week number 1 is going to go to Ruler on JD Gaming. He was fantastic. He gets a pentakill in his first series. Almost got 2. He looked really, really good for JDG. That JDG team, the hands are certainly showing through, and Ruler, in my opinion, absolutely deserves player of the week for week 1. And my dud of the week is going to go to Harder on Anyone's Legend. A rough week for a mid laner that might not be starting all of that much longer in the LPL. Anyone's Legend did not look good, and Harder was a big example of that. So Ruler is my player of the week. Harder is my dud of the week for week number 1 in the LPL, and that is going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like down below. Let me know in the comment section below where you guys think I'm too high, where you think I'm too low, who was your player of the week, and who was your dud of the week. I'd love to hear you guys' feedback down below. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I put out weekly reviews, not only of the LPL, but of all 4 major regions, LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL, as well as the NACL, the NACL, the Salt League. We'll be doing that as well this year. So if you guys are excited for any of that content, hit that subscribe button. Let me know down in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.